The flashing blue and red lights cut through the quiet suburban night, reflecting violently off the polished black exterior of the Mercedes SUV. Inside sat a man who commanded hundreds of thousands of troops, held top-tier security clearances, and answered directly to the Secretary of Defense. But to the patrol officer walking up to the window with his hand resting dangerously close to his holster, the man behind the wheel wasn't a decorated four-star general. He was just a target. What happens next isn't just a clash of authority. It's a masterclass in catastrophic misjudgment that would shatter an entire police department and deliver the ultimate dose of inescapable karma. The affluent suburb of Oak Ridge was the kind of town where the lawns were manicured with mathematical precision. The streetlights cast a warm, inviting glow, and the police department operated under the unspoken mandate of keeping the ruining sort of people out. General David Reynolds knew this demographic well. At 58 years old, with salt and pepper haircut close to his scalp and a posture forged by 35 years in the United States Army, he had navigated hostile territories far more dangerous than an upper-middle-class neighborhood in the Midwest. David had just returned stateside after a grueling 3-year assignment commanding Allied forces in Europe. He had purchased a sprawling property in Oak Ridge sight unseen, relying on his wife's excellent taste. Tonight he was driving home from the regional airport in his newly delivered Mercedes-Benz G-Class, dressed comfortably in a plain gray hoodie, dark jeans, and a faded baseball cap. After a 14-hour flight and a series of exhausting briefings at the Pentagon, all he wanted was to sleep in his own bed. 2 miles from his new home, a marked Oak Ridge Police Department cruiser pulled out from a side street and fell in behind him. Officer Brian Kessler had been with the Oak Ridge Force for 12 years. He was a man who viewed his badge not as a shield for the community, but as a crown. Kessler had a reputation in the department for proactive policing, a sanitized term his superiors used to cover up his staggering number of profiling complaints. Kessler prided himself on his instinct. When he saw the brand-new 6-figure SUV cruise past him at exactly the speed limit, his eyes immediately sought out the driver. In the glow of the street lamps, he saw a black man in a hoodie. Kessler's jaw tightened. In his mind, the math was simple and deeply prejudiced. The car didn't match the driver. Therefore, the driver didn't belong in Oak Ridge. Kessler hit the gas, closing the distance between the cruiser and the Mercedes. He ran the plates through his onboard computer. The system lagged, returning a registration pending status perfectly normal for a vehicle purchased out of state and delivered days prior, but for Kessler it was the only excuse he needed. He waited for the Mercedes to approach a subtle curve in the road. When David's rear tire brushed the solid white line on the shoulder for a fraction of a second, Kessler slapped the button for his emergency lights. Inside the Mercedes, David let out a slow, controlled breath. He glanced in his rearview mirror at the blinding strobe of red and blue. He didn't panic. He didn't speed up. He smoothly engaged his right turn signal, pulled over to the brightest section of the shoulder under a streetlight, shifted the vehicle into park, and turned off the engine. He rolled down all 4 windows, a habit born of an abundance of caution, turned on the interior dome light, and placed his large, calloused hands squarely on the top of the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions. He had worn 4 stars on his shoulders. He had orchestrated military campaigns that altered the course of global geopolitics. Yet, as a black man in America, he knew that in the specific scenario, none of that mattered to the man approaching his car. Surviving the next 10 minutes required absolute discipline. Kessler approached the vehicle with a practiced swagger. His right hand rested heavily on the butt of his sidearm, the retention strap already unsnapped. He stopped just behind the B-pillar of the Mercedes, forcing David to turn his head awkwardly to make eye contact. "Evening," David said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that naturally commanded a room. Kessler didn't return the greeting. He shined his heavy tactical flashlight directly into David's eyes, holding the beam steady to induce maximum discomfort. "License, registration, and proof of insurance." "Now, officer, my wallet is in my back right pocket. My registration and insurance are in the glove compartment." How would you like me to proceed? David asked calmly, squinting against the blinding glare. I said get your license and registration, Kessler snapped, his tone dripping with immediate hostility. Don't play games with me. Whose car is this? It's mine, David replied, slowly moving his right hand toward his back pocket. He kept his movements deliberate and telegraphed. He extracted a slim leather wallet, pulled out his driver's license, and handed it through the window. He then reached slowly across to the glove compartment, retrieved the temporary registration paperwork, and handed that over as well. Kessler snatched the documents. He examined the driver's license, noting the out-of-state address, and then looked at the registration. David Reynolds, out-of-state license. Brand new gegen Wandikan. What are you doing in Oak Ridge, David? I live here, David stated evenly. I just moved into the neighborhood on Crestview Drive. I'm driving home from the airport. Kessler scoffed, a short, ugly sound. Crestview Drive, right. Those houses run $2 million and up. You expect me to believe you live there? What you believe is entirely up to you, officer. I've provided my documentation. Was there a specific reason you pulled me over? The calm defiance in David's voice irritated Kessler. He was used to fear. He thrived on the nervous stuttering of civilians realizing they were at his mercy. This man wasn't afraid. He was annoyed, and he was completely unimpressed. You failed to maintain your lane, Kessler said, stepping slightly closer to the window. Swerving all over the road. Have you been drinking tonight? No, officer. I haven't had a drink in 20 years. We'll see about that, Kessler muttered. He leaned his head closer to the window, dramatically sniffing the air. I smell marijuana. You smoking something in here? It was a blatant, fabricated lie. The only thing the pristine interior of the Mercedes smelled like was expensive leather and the faint trace of David's aftershave. But David knew exactly what the claim meant. It was the magic phrase the fabricated probable cause needed to bypass the Fourth Amendment. There is no marijuana in this vehicle, David said, his tone dropping an octave, carrying the first edge of a warning. And I do not consent to any searches of my person or my property. Kessler's eyes narrowed. The flashlight beam wavered slightly as his grip tightened on the heavy metal casing. Step out of the vehicle. Step out of the vehicle, Kessler repeated, his voice rising in volume. He took a half step back, his hand firmly gripping his firearm now. David Reynolds did not move immediately. He processed the tactical situation with the cold, calculating efficiency of a seasoned combat commander. The officer was escalating without cause. He was demonstrating confirmation bias, aggression, and a clear disregard for standard protocol. David knew that arguing law on the side of a dark road was a losing battle, often a fatal one. Officer, David said, keeping his hands anchored to the steering wheel. I am going to unbuckle my seatbelt now. I will step out of the car as you requested. I am unarmed, and I am not a threat to you. Less talking, more moving, Kessler barked. He unclipped his radio mic. Dispatch, Ford Avenue 12, I need a second unit at my 1020. Uncooperative suspect. David slowly unclicked his seatbelt. He pushed the door open with his left hand and stepped out onto the asphalt. Even in sneakers and a hoodie, David stood an imposing 6'2". His broad shoulders and straight spine made him tower over the slightly shorter, stockier police officer. The physical disparity seemed to enrage Kessler further. Turn around and face the car. Put your hands behind your back. Kessler shouted, already reaching for his handcuffs. Am I under arrest? David asked, turning slowly and placing his hands behind his back. You're being detained, Kessler growled. He grabbed David's wrists with unnecessary force, wrenching his arms upward before snapping the cold steel cuffs tightly around his wrists. He squeezed the ratchets down until the metal bit into David's skin. Spread your legs. Kessler kicked David's feet apart and began a rough, aggressive pat-down search. He moved his hands forcefully over David's pockets, down his legs and up his torso, ostensibly checking for weapons but clearly intending to demean and provoke. He found nothing but a cell phone and the slim leather wallet he had just handed back. "Stand by the front of my cruiser," Kessler ordered, shoving David forcefully in the shoulder. David stumbled slightly but caught his balance, walking to the front of the patrol car and standing in the blinding glare of the headlights. He stared straight ahead, his face an impassive mask. Inside, however, a cold, focused anger was building. He had dedicated his entire adult life to defending the Constitution of the United States, bleeding on foreign soil so that the rights enshrined in that document would endure. To have those rights so casually and arrogantly violated by a man sworn to uphold them locally was a profound insult. A second patrol car came screeching to a halt on the opposite side of the road. A younger officer, badge name Jenkins, practically tumbled out of the driver's side. Jenkins looked barely old enough to drink, his eyes darting nervously between Kessler and the handcuffed man illuminated by the headlights. "What do we got, Brian?" Jenkins asked, jogging over, his hand resting on his taser. "Got a live one," Kessler sneered, walking back toward the Mercedes. "Claims he lives on Crestview. Swerving, smelled weed, is acting sketchy. Keep an eye on him while I toss the car." "Officer." David's voice cut through the night air, sharp and commanding. Both cops looked at him. "I stated clearly that I do not consent to a search of my vehicle. If you enter that car, you are violating my Fourth Amendment rights, and you will be held fully accountable both professionally and personally." Kessler stopped and laughed. It was a harsh, ugly sound. "Listen to the lawyer in the hoodie. I have probable cause, buddy. I smell weed. That gives me all the permission I need." Kessler leaned into the Mercedes, tearing through the center console, ripping paperwork out of the glove box, and pulling the custom floor mats out, tossing them onto the dirty asphalt. He moved to the back seat, unzipping David's duffel bag, scattering folded clothes, a shaving kit, and several heavy leather-bound briefing binders across the expensive leather seats. Jenkins stood near David, looking increasingly uncomfortable. He glanced at the stoic, impeccably calm man in handcuffs, then at the destruction Kessler was causing to the brand-new vehicle. "So," Jenkins tried to make awkward small talk, you work around here?" David turned his head slowly to look at the young officer. "I work in Washington, D.C. Mostly, and overseas." Jenkins swallowed hard, intimidated by the sheer intensity of the man's gaze. "Oh, what do you do?" Before David could answer, Kessler slammed the trunk of the Mercedes shut with a frustrated curse. He hadn't found any drugs. He hadn't found any weapons. He had found absolutely nothing to justify the stop, let alone a search. Furious that his instincts were wrong, he marched back over to David, holding David's wallet. Kessler began pulling cards out of the wallet, inspecting them under his flashlight. Credit cards, a frequent flyer card, and then a thick, rigid white plastic card, a United States Department of Defense Common Access card. Kessler squinted at it. It had David's photo. It had a barcode, and under the branch of service it read USA. Under rank it read Jen. Jenkins looked up, a mocking grin spreading across his face. "General? You expect me to believe you're a general in the U.S. Army?" "A 4-star general? That is my official Department of Defense identification, officer," David said quietly. "It is federal property. I highly recommend you treat it with respect." "This is the best fake ID I've ever seen," Kessler laughed, holding it up for Jenkins to see. "Look at this, rookie. Guy thinks he's Colin Powell. Where'd you buy this, Dave?" "Internet." Jenkins squinted at the card. He had a cousin in the National Guard. He knew what a CAC looked like, and this one looked incredibly real. The hologram in the corner caught the light perfectly. A sudden cold pit formed in Jenkins's stomach. Brian, that looks pretty authentic." "Shut up, Jenkins. It's a fake," Kessler snapped, shoving the card back into the wallet. He stepped right up to David's face. "You're under arrest. Forging federal identification, providing false information to a police officer, and I'm citing you for the lanes. We're going to the station, General." "Officer Kessler," David said, reading the man's non-tag, "I am giving you one final opportunity to call your watch commander to this location. If you place me in the back of that cruiser, you will cross a line that you will not be able to walk back from. This will end your career." Kessler's face flushed red with rage. He grabbed David by the bicep, spinning him roughly toward the rear door of the cruiser. "My career is just fine. Yours as a fig general is over. Get in the car." Kessler shoved David's head down aggressively and forced him into the hard plastic back seat of the patrol car, slamming the door shut. Jenkins watched, paralyzed by indecision. He looked at the torn-apart Mercedes, then at Kessler. "Brian, what if he's telling the truth? What if he is a general?" "Don't be an idiot," Kessler spat, getting into the driver's seat. "Guys like that don't drive around here at midnight in hoodies. Call a tow truck, impound the Benz. Let's see how much he likes paying storage fees." As the cruiser pulled away, heading toward the precinct, David Reynolds sat perfectly still in the darkness of the back seat. He felt the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. He took a deep breath, letting the anger settle into a cold, hard resolve. Kessler wanted to play the system. He was about to find out exactly who built the system. The Oak Ridge Police Department's 12th precinct was a modern, brick-and-glass building that looked more like a corporate accounting firm than a police station. At 11:45 p.m., the front desk was quiet. The holding area, located behind a set of heavy, reinforced steel doors, was brightly lit, with harsh fluorescent bulbs that hummed aggressively. Officer Kessler marched David through the sallyport doors, maintaining a tight, unnecessary grip on his arm. David walked with his head held high, his gait even and measured despite his hands being bound behind his back. Desk Sergeant Thomas O'Connor looked up from his computer monitor as the heavy doors clanged shut. O'Connor was a 20-year veteran of the force, a man who had seen every type of criminal and every type of cop. Before he wore the blue uniform, he had worn the digital camouflage of the United States Marine Corps, serving 2 tours in Fallujah as a military police officer. He was a man who appreciated order, procedure, and, above all, the chain of command. "What do we have, Kessler?" O'Connor asked, his voice a gravelly rumble. He reached for a blank booking sheet. "Got a live one, Sarge," Kessler said proudly, practically shoving David toward the booking counter. Traffic stop turned into a whole thing. Swerving. Suspected DUI, though he blew clean on the breathalyzer I gave him in the field. But here's the kicker, he's carrying forged federal documents. O'Connor raised an eyebrow. He looked at David. He didn't see a tweaker, a gangbanger, or a panicked civilian. He saw a man standing in parade rest, despite the handcuffs. He saw a man whose eyes were calmly scanning the room, taking in the exits, the camera placements, the badge numbers of the 3 other officers milling around the bullpen. The man wasn't looking at them with fear. He was assessing them. "Forged documents?" O'Connor asked, holding out his hand. Kessler tossed David's wallet onto the counter. "Yeah, guy has a fake military ID. Claims he's a 4-star general." Kessler chuckled, looking around the room to invite the other officers into the joke. A couple of them smirked. O'Connor didn't smirk. He opened the wallet and pulled out the white plastic card. He held it up to the harsh fluorescent light. As a former Marine MP, O'Connor had checked thousands of common access cards. He knew the weight of the plastic. He knew the specific microprinting on the edges. He knew the exact way the Department of Defense Eagle hologram was supposed to shift when tilted. He tilted the card. The eagle danced perfectly in the light. O'Connor's heart skipped a beat. He looked at the name, Reimolds David M. He looked at the rank, Gen. He looked at the expiration date, the Geneva Conventions category, the agency seal. It was flawless. If it was a fake, it was printed on a DoD machine by the Secretary of Defense himself. Slowly, O'Connor lowered the card and looked at the man in the handcuffs. For the first time, he really looked at his face. He mentally stripped away the gray hoodie and replaced it with an Army service uniform. He imagined 4 silver stars sitting heavily on the epaulets. A memory buried deep from his time following military news surfaced. He remembered a Time magazine cover from a few years ago about the brilliant tactician leading forces in Eastern Europe. A cold sweat broke out across the back of O'Connor's neck. The air in the booking room suddenly felt extremely thin. "Kessler," O'Connor said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register. "Where did you arrest this man?" "Over on Miller Road near the new Crestview development." He was driving a brand new G-Wagon. Claimed it was his. Claimed he lived there, Kessler rattled off, oblivious to the sergeant's changing demeanor. "I'm going to book him for forgery, providing false information, and—" "Shut up, Kessler," O'Connor snapped. The harshness of the command echoed in the quiet room. The other officers in the bullpen stopped talking and turned to look. Kessler blinked, offended. "Excuse me, Sarge." O'Connor ignored him. He stood up from his desk and walked around the counter. He approached David. As he got closer, the sheer physical presence of the man in handcuffs hit him. The bearing was undeniable. "Sir," O'Connor said, his voice respectful, almost trembling. The use of the word "sir" to a suspect made Kessler's jaw drop. "Can you verify your identity?" David looked down at the sergeant. His eyes were like chipped flint. "My name is General David Michael Reynolds, United States Army, commander of the Allied Joint Force Command. My service number is on that card. I suggest you run it through the National Crime Information Center database, or better yet, call the Pentagon Watch Desk. The number is on the back of the card." The bullpen was dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the lights and the rattling of the air conditioning vent. Kessler let out a loud, nervous laugh. "Sarge, you aren't actually buying this, are you?" "He's a hustler." O'Connor turned his head slowly, locking eyes with Kessler. "If you speak one more time, Officer Kessler, I will personally throw you in a holding cell. Do you understand me?" Kessler swallowed hard, taking a step back. "Sarge, sit down," O'Connor roared. O'Connor turned back to his desk. His hands were shaking slightly as he picked up the phone. He didn't dial the local database. He flipped the CAC over, read the emergency verification number on the back, and dialed it. He needed absolute confirmation before he initiated the protocol for what he was about to do. The phone rang twice. Department of Defense Operations Center. Specialist Miller speaking on an unsecure line. "How can I direct your call?" "Yes, this is Sergeant Thomas O'Connor, Oak Ridge Police Department, Ohio. Badge number 4421. I need to verify the status of a general officer." "Copy that, Sergeant. Go ahead with the DOD ID number." O'Connor read the long string of digits off the back of the card. He waited. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. The silence stretched, pulling the tension in the room taut enough to snap. "Sergeant O'Connor," the voice on the other end returned, no longer sounding like a bored clerk, but sharp and alert. "I am transferring you to the office of the Army Chief of Staff immediately. Do not disconnect." O'Connor closed his eyes. The floor felt like it was dropping out from under him. "You didn't get transferred to the Chief of Staff's office for a fake ID." A new voice clicked on the line. "This is Colonel Hayes. Identify yourself." O'Connor repeated his name and department. "Sergeant O'Connor, you ran an inquiry on General David Reynolds. What is the general's status, and why do you have his identification?" O'Connor looked up. He looked at Kessler, who was now pale, shifting his weight nervously. He looked at the 4-star general standing in his booking room, wearing a hoodie, his hands cuffed behind his back like a common street thief. "Colonel," O'Connor said, his voice cracking slightly, "General Reynolds is currently standing in my booking room. He is in handcuffs." There was a silence on the line so profound it felt like a physical weight. When Colonel Hayes spoke again, his voice was ice cold, carrying the weight of the entire United States military apparatus. "Sergeant, you are to keep the general exactly where he is. Do not attempt to process him. Do not question him. I am patching in the FBI Field Office Director for your region, and the Adjutant General of the Ohio National Guard. Your chief of police has approximately 10 minutes to get down to your station before a team of federal agents arrives to dismantle it." The line went dead. O'Connor slowly hung up the phone. He looked at Kessler. Kessler's arrogant smirk was entirely gone, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He had finally realized what he had done. He hadn't just arrested an innocent man. He had kidnapped one of the highest-ranking military officers in the free world. O'Connor grabbed the master keys from his belt. He walked around the desk, bypassing Kessler completely, and stopped in front of General Reynolds. "General," O'Connor said, his voice barely above a whisper as he reached behind David's back and unlocked the handcuffs. "I cannot express how profoundly sorry I am." "That's an apple." David rubbed his wrist slowly, bringing his arms forward. He looked at O'Connor, then his gaze slowly drifted over to Officer Kessler, who looked like he was about to vomit. "Sergeant," David said, his voice ringing out clearly in the dead-silent room, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Call your chief, wake him up. Tell him he has a very narrow window to explain to me why his officers operate like a rogue militia. And as for him," David pointed a long, steady finger at Kessler, "secure his weapon and his badge. He's done." The next 20 minutes inside the 12th precinct felt like a slow-motion collapse of an entire ecosystem. Officer Brian Kessler sat frozen on a hard plastic chair in the corner of the bullpen, stripped of his duty belt, his radio, and his sidearm. The arrogant swagger that had defined his 12-year career had completely evaporated, replaced by the pale, clammy complexion of a man watching his life's work burn to the ground. Sergeant O'Connor had immediately ordered Kessler disarmed the moment the call with the Pentagon concluded, treating the disgraced patrolman not as a fellow officer but as a severe liability. General David Reynolds sat quietly at O'Connor's desk, sipping a cup of black coffee the sergeant had nervously poured for him. Despite the civilian hoodie and the lingering red indentations on his wrists, Reynolds projected an aura of absolute command. He didn't gloat. He didn't pace. He simply waited, letting the agonizing silence do the work of breaking Kessler down. At 12:15 a.m., the heavy glass doors of the precinct were violently thrown open. Chief Robert Harrison burst into the lobby. The chief of the Oak Ridge Police Department was a political creature, a man who spent more time at golf fundraisers than managing his patrol divisions. Tonight he looked entirely unraveled. He was wearing suit trousers and a hastily buttoned dress shirt with no tie, his face flushed red with panic. Behind him were two imposing men in dark windbreakers bearing the yellow letters FBI, and a man in a sharp suit who carried the unmistakable bearing of an Army Criminal Investigation Division CID special agent. "Where is he?" Chief Harrison barked, sprinting past the front desk and swiping his access card to the Sallyport doors. He froze the second he saw the 4-star general sitting calmly in the bullpen. Harrison's eyes darted to Kessler, disarmed and sweating in the corner, and then to O'Connor. "General Reynolds," Chief Harrison practically gasped, crossing the room with his hand extended. "I am Chief Harrison. Sir, I cannot begin to express the magnitude of my apologies. There has been a catastrophic failure of procedure here tonight." David did not stand up. He did not take the chief's extended hand. He simply set his coffee cup down and looked the man dead in the eye. "A failure of procedure implies a mistake, Chief Harrison." David's voice was smooth, low, and lethal. "Failing to check a box is a mistake. What your officer did to me on Miller Road was a deliberate, targeted deprivation of my constitutional rights. It was racial profiling, followed by an illegal search, unlawful detainment, and an attempted fabrication of federal charges." The FBI special agent in charge stepped forward, flashing a gold shield. "General, I am Special Agent William Carter, FBI Civil Rights Division. This is Special Agent Richard Dawson with Army CID. Are you injured, sir?" "I am unharmed, Agent Carter," David replied, finally standing up to address the federal agents. "However, my vehicle, which contains sensitive Department of Defense materials, is currently sitting on the side of the road or in the custody of a local tow company, fully compromised by that officer." Nuss. Dawson from Army CID snapped his head toward Chief Harrison. Chief, with a local impound lot so much as breeze on that vehicle, I will have the National Guard lock down your entire city grid. The trunk of that Mercedes contains encrypted Tier 1 satellite communication arrays for the Joint Chiefs. Did your officer gain access to the trunk? Chief Harrison turned a terrifying shade of gray. He whipped his head toward Kessler. Kessler, did you open the trunk? Kessler's voice trembled so violently he could barely form words. I popped the latch, Chief. I couldn't get the secondary lock open. It looked like a heavy metal box. I thought it was a drug stash. Agent Carter sighed, shaking his head. You attempted to breach a Department of Defense CIS high-level communications node because you smelled phantom marijuana on a 4-star general. Congratulations, officer. You haven't just violated his civil rights, you've triggered a federal espionage and tampering protocol. Kessler buried his face in his hands, letting out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. Chief Harrison, David said, cutting through the panic. I am not interested in your apologies. I'm interested in your department's culture. You don't get an officer like Kessler in a vacuum. He's a product of an environment that tolerates, if not encourages, predatory policing against minorities. Tonight he pulled over the wrong man, but how many young men, without my rank, without my resources, have sat in that exact chair and had their lives ruined by his instincts? Harrison swallowed hard. General, I assure you, we will handle this internally with the utmost severity. He will be suspended pending a full... No, Chief, you won't handle this internally, Agent Carter interrupted, his voice echoing with federal authority. The FBI is taking jurisdiction over this case as of 3 minutes ago. Title 18, U.S. Code Section 2422, Deprivation of Rights under color of law. Furthermore, Army CID is initiating a parallel investigation regarding the tampering with classified federal equipment. Carter turned to the other FBI agent. Secure the local servers. I want all dashcam and bodycam footage from Kessler's vehicle and Jenkins' vehicle uploaded to our drives immediately, before the local union rep gets out of bed and the files magically corrupt. By 8 a.m. the next morning, the story had violently broken containment. What had started as a quiet, racially motivated traffic stop in a sleepy, affluent suburb had escalated into a full-blown national scandal. Officer Brian Kessler had not been allowed to go home. He was relocated from the bullpen to Interrogation Room B, the exact windowless, freezing cold room where he had spent a decade breaking down frightened suspects. Now the tables were catastrophically turned. Sitting across from him wasn't a sympathetic union delegate. It was Agent Carter and a ruthless federal prosecutor named Arthur Pendleton. We have the dash cam, Brian, Carter said, sliding a polished iPad across the steel table. We have the body cam. We have the audio of you blatantly ignoring the general's denial of consent to search. We have the footage of you aggressively applying handcuffs to a compliant, non-violent federal official. Kessler stared blankly at the table. I had reasonable suspicion. The vehicle was swerving. Pendleton, the prosecutor, leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. We pulled the telemetry data from the Mercedes onboard computer. Kessler. It's a 2026 model. It lobs steering wheel angle, lane positioning, and speed every millisecond. The car never crossed the white line. Not even by an inch. Your probable cause was a complete fabrication. Kessler flinched. The absolute certainty in his world that his badge was an impenetrable shield against consequences was shattering piece by piece. My union rep, Kessler croaked, his throat dry. Patrick Sullivan, he should be here. Sullivan called an hour ago, Carter replied, his voice devoid of pity. Once he found out you illegally detained a 4-star general, accused him of forging a DOD, and attempted to pry open a classified military communications vault. Well, the local police union suddenly found a conflict of interest. They are legally required to provide you a lawyer, but they are completely washing their hands of your defense. You are a political and public relations nightmare. Marched on. But the true killing blow came not from the federal agents, but from his own backup. 2 rooms away, young Officer Jenkins was frantically trying to save his own nascent career. Realizing the apocalyptic scale of the federal response, Jenkins had immediately invoked his right to cooperate. He sat with Army CID investigators, spilling every detail of the night. He targeted him the second the Mercedes drove past, Jenkins said nervously, his hand shaking around a paper cup of water. Ryan, Officer Kessler, he always does this. If a black or Hispanic driver is in Oak Ridge after dark in a nice car, Kessler finds a reason to stop them. He bragged about it. He called it keeping the neighborhood pure. Last night he smelled the weed before he even reached the window. It was a script. Jenkins' testimony was the nail in the coffin. The blue wall of silence, the unspoken code that cops never snitched on cops, crumbled under the terrifying weight of the United States military and the Department of Justice. Meanwhile, at the Pentagon, the incident had reached the desk of the Secretary of Defense. General Reynolds had returned to Washington on a military transport aircraft at dawn, his compromised civilian vehicle secured and transported by an armed military convoy. Reynolds was summoned to the E-Ring. He walked into the Secretary's office, immaculate in his Class A uniform, 4 stars gleaming, a stark contrast to the man in the hoodie from the night before. "David," the Secretary said, shaking his head in disbelief as he read the preliminary CID report. "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly fine, Mr. Secretary," David replied, his posture rigid. "But I am deeply concerned. I spent 35 years defending this country's democratic ideals abroad, only to return home and find them utterly suspended for citizens who look like me. If this is what happens to a general in the United States Army, what is happening to the college student driving home from a late shift? What is happening to the father taking his kids to school?" The Secretary leaned back, tapping a pen against his desk. "The DOJ is going to make an example out of Kessler. They are drafting a federal indictment today. With all due respect, sir, Kessler is a symptom," David countered firmly. "The Oak Ridge Police Department allowed this. Chief Harrison allowed this. I don't just want Kessler's badge. I want a federal consent decree placed on that entire department. I want every single traffic stop Kessler has made in the last 12 years audited by the Civil Rights Division. Every conviction that relied solely on his testimony needs to be reviewed for vacatur." The Secretary looked at the General, seeing the same tactical brilliance that had dismantled enemy strongholds now focused intensely on domestic injustice. "That is going to cause a massive political earthquake in that state." David's eyes narrowed, cold and unyielding. "Then let it shake." The political earthquake General Reynolds promised struck the Oak Ridge Police Department with the force of a Category 5 hurricane. Within 48 hours of the traffic stop, the sleepy, affluent suburb was unrecognizable. Dozens of dark, government-plated suburbans lined the streets around the 12th precinct. News vans from every major national network choked the parking lots. The Oak Ridge Police Department had not just been put under investigation, it had been effectively occupied. Arthur Pendleton, the ruthless federal prosecutor assigned to the case, did not believe in half measures. Armed with a mandate from the highest levels of the Justice Department, he launched a systemic excavation of Brian Kessler's entire 12-year career. A team of 40 forensic auditors, FBI civil rights investigators, and independent legal analysts descended upon the precinct's record room. They seized hard drives, locked down the evidence lockers, and subpoenaed the personal financial records of every command staff officer. For Kessler, the descent into absolute ruin was swift and merciless. Released on a $500,000 bond which he only secured by putting up the equity on his house and borrowing heavily from his increasingly estranged parents, he found himself a prisoner in his own home. He was stripped of his badge, his firearm, and his pension. The police union, terrified of the catastrophic optics of defending a man who had unlawfully detained a 4-star general and triggered an espionage protocol, publicly disavowed him. His phone stopped ringing. The fellow officers who used to laugh at his crude jokes and back up his predatory stops suddenly developed profound amnesia. When Kessler dared to venture to a local grocery store, the community that once viewed him as a protector now stared at him with undisguised contempt. Someone had spray-painted "Federal Prisoner" across his garage door in glowing orange letters. But the true nightmare for Kessler wasn't the public humiliation. It was the relentless unearthing of his past. Agent William Carter and his team began pulling the threads of Kessler's proactive policing statistics. They cross-referenced his arrest reports with demographic data, dashcam footage, and court outcomes. What they found was a staggering, undeniable pattern of malicious prosecution. They discovered over 40 cases where Kessler had used the exact same fabricated script, claiming a vehicle swerved, claiming he smelled marijuana, and subsequently conducting an illegal search. One case that Pendleton specifically targeted involved a 22-year-old engineering student named Devin Hughes. 3 years prior, Kessler had pulled Devin over in Oak Ridge, claiming a broken taillight that was, in reality, perfectly functional. Kessler claimed to smell marijuana, tore Devin's car apart, and magically found a small baggie of narcotics wedged deep under the passenger seat. Devin had lost his university scholarship, spent 6 months in county jail, and was forced into taking a plea deal just to survive. When Agent Carter reviewed the newly recovered bodycam footage from that night footage that Chief Harrison's department claimed had been accidentally corrupted, the truth was glaringly obvious. The footage showed Kessler palming a small baggie before leaning into the vehicle. It was a blatant, undeniable plant. The dominoes began to fall. Pendleton's office filed motions to vacate the convictions of Devin Hughes and 39 other individuals whose lives had been derailed by Kessler's fabricated evidence. The city of Oak Ridge was suddenly facing a tsunami of civil rights lawsuits that threatened to completely bankrupt the municipality. Desperation makes fools out of arrogant men, and Kessler was no exception. Realizing that the walls were closing in and that he was facing decades in federal lockup, he made a fatal miscalculation. Late one night, fueled by cheap whiskey and sheer panic, Kessler used a burner phone to call Officer Jenkins, the young rookie who had been at the scene with the general. "Jenkins, listen to me." Kessler slurred into the phone, pacing his living room. "You need to amend your statement to CID. You need to say the general was belligerent. You need to say he reached for his waistband. If you don't back my play, I'm going to tell the feds about that excessive force complaint from last year that I helped you cover up. We sink together, rookie." Kessler didn't know 2 crucial facts. First, Jenkins had already confessed everything to the FBI to secure federal immunity. Second, due to the pending espionage charges regarding the tampering with General Reynolds' classified vehicle, Kessler's home, cell phone, and even his newly purchased burner phone were operating under a Title III federal wiretap. Agent Carter, sitting in an FBI listening post 3 miles away, pulled his headphones down and smiled. Well, add witness tampering, extortion, and obstruction of justice to the indictment. He just buried himself. The fallout wasn't limited to Kessler. Chief Robert Harrison, realizing the city council was preparing to fire him and strip his pension, attempted to hold a press conference to announce his early, honorable retirement to spend more time with his family. He didn't make it to the podium. 15 minutes before the press conference was scheduled to begin, Agent Carter and 2 deputies walked into the chief's private office. "Chief Harrison," Carter said, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to deprive civil rights under color of law, obstruction of justice, and misprision of a felony. Your retirement is officially cancelled." Harrison was marched out the front doors of his own precinct, his hands cuffed behind his back, right past the gauntlet of national media cameras he had assembled. The ultimate karma had arrived. The architect of Oak Ridge's toxic policing culture was subjected to the exact same perp walk his officers had weaponized against innocent citizens for years. 8 months later, the United States District Court for the Northern District of Ohio was a fortress. Concrete barricades lined the perimeter, and federal marshals heavily secured every entrance. Inside courtroom 4B, the air was thick with tension. This was not a standard trial. It was a highly publicized federal reckoning. Brian Kessler sat at the defense table wearing an ill-fitting gray suit. The swagger was gone. The arrogance had been meticulously dismantled by months of stress, isolation, and the terrifying reality of federal prosecution. He looked 10 years older, his hair thinning, his posture permanently slumped. Next to him sat his court-appointed defense attorney, William Gable, a man who looked thoroughly exhausted by the sheer volume of evidence stacked against his client. Arthur Pendleton stood at the prosecution's podium. He had built an ironclad case. Over the past 2 weeks, Pendleton had paraded a devastating lineup of witnesses to the stand. Desk Sergeant O'Connor had testified about Kessler's arrogant disregard for protocol. Officer Jenkins, trembling but resolute, recounted the blatant profiling and the attempted extortion on the burner phone. But the most damning testimonies came from the ghosts of Kessler's past. Devon Hughes took the stand, his record freshly expunged, and looked directly into Kessler's eyes as he detailed how the disgraced cop had stolen 3 years of his life. One by one, the victims of Kessler's proactive policing stood up, taking their power back in the very legal system Kessler had manipulated. Finally, on the second day of the 3rd week, Pendleton called his star witness. The United States calls General David Michael Reynolds to the stand. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. General Reynolds walked down the center aisle. He was not wearing a gray hoodie today. He was in his full Army service uniform. 4 silver stars rested with heavy authority on his shoulders. The ribbons on his chest told a story of 3 decades of valor, sacrifice, and leadership. Every eye in the courtroom followed him. The sheer gravity of his presence commanded absolute silence. He took the oath, his deep baritone echoing off the mahogany walls, and sat in the witness box. Pendleton walked his witness through the events of that night. Reynolds spoke with chilling precision. He didn't embellish. He didn't need to. He described the aggressive tailgating, the lack of a traffic violation, the immediate escalation, the refusal to honor the 4th Amendment, and the degrading physical treatment. General Reynolds, Pendleton asked, pausing for dramatic effect, when the defendant discovered your Department of Defense identification, how did he react? He mocked it, Reynolds replied smoothly, his gaze shifting to lock onto Kessler. Kessler immediately looked down at the table, unable to meet the general's eyes. He accused me of forgery. He treated a piece of federal property representing my lifelong commission to this nation as a prop in his own fabricated narrative. He did not see a military officer. Well, he only saw a stereotype he wished to punish. Gable, the defense attorney, knew better than to aggressively cross-examine a decorated 4-star general. He asked a few procedural questions, trying desperately to suggest that the dark lighting or the newness of the vehicle had caused a reasonable misunderstanding. Reynolds didn't let him have an inch. Counselor, there was no misunderstanding. There was a targeted execution of prejudice. The defendant's actions were deliberate, practiced, and malicious. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, the foreman stood up and handed the verdict sheet to the bailiff. Judge Rosalind Pierce, a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for handing down severe sentences in civil rights cases, read the verdict aloud. Guilty on the deprivation of civil rights. Guilty on false imprisonment. Guilty on witness tampering. Guilty on obstruction of justice. Guilty on all 12 federal counts. A collective breath was released in the courtroom. Behind the prosecution table, Devon Hughes quietly began to weep, his mother holding his hand. Kessler just stared at the wooden table, his face entirely hollow. Judge Pierce did not delay the sentencing. She looked down at Kessler from the bench, her expression one of absolute disgust. "Mr. Kessler," Judge Pierce began, her voice ringing out like a gavel strike, "you were given a badge and a gun to protect your community. Instead, you weaponized that authority to terrorize it. You treated the Constitution of the United States as an inconvenience to be bypassed whenever it suited your prejudices. You ruined lives. You planted evidence. You operated under the delusion that your uniform made you untouchable. She paused, looking out at the gallery, her eyes resting briefly on General Reynolds. You thought you pulled over just another victim you could easily silence. Instead, you pulled over a man who possesses more integrity, courage, and honor in his little finger than you have exhibited in your entire life. You pulled over the United States Army, and the resulting investigation finally brought your dark, corrupt kingdom to an end. Bite through, Brian Kessler, on the counts of civil rights violations, witness tampering, and obstruction, I sentence you to 180 months, 15 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. You're remanded immediately to the custody of the United States Marshals. The sound of the heavy metal handcuffs clicking around Kessler's wrists echoed loudly in the silent courtroom. It was the exact same sound David Reynolds had heard on the side of Miller Road, but this time it was the sound of actual justice. Kessler was called to his feet by two massive marshals. He looked back one last time, his eyes searching the room for any shred of sympathy. He found none. He was dragged out the side door, disappearing into the dark machinery of the federal penal system. Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining brightly. General David Reynolds walked down the wide concrete steps, surrounded by reporters shouting questions. He didn't stop at the microphones. He simply gave a brief, respectful nod to the crowd. He walked over to where his black Mercedes G-Class was parked at the curb, its trunk secure, its interior pristine once again. Desk Sergeant O'Connor, who had been promoted to interim captain to help clean up the department under the watchful eye of the federal monitors, stood by the car. "Thank you for your testimony today, General," O'Connor said, saluting sharply. "The department, the city. We're going to fix this. We are rebuilding from the ground up." David returned the salute. "See that you do, Captain. The people of this city deserve a shield, not a weapon." David climbed into the driver's seat. He adjusted his rearview mirror, put the car in drive, and merged smoothly into the afternoon traffic. The flashing red and blue lights of the Oak Ridge cruisers were nowhere to be seen. The road ahead was entirely clear. The story of General Reynolds and Officer Kessler serves as a powerful reminder that arrogance and prejudice will inevitably collide with a force they cannot overcome. True power doesn't reside in a badge used to bully and demean. It resides in integrity, the defense of constitutional rights, and the quiet dignity of those who refuse to be broken by a corrupt system. Kessler thought he was the law, but he learned the hard way that justice is blind, and karma never misses its target. This case didn't just end one bad cop's career, it dismantled an entire culture of corruption and gave back the lives of dozens of innocent people. If this story of ultimate karma and justice served resonated with you, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends to spread the message, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life stories of dramatic twists and justice prevailing.